Hi, it's so great to
Hi.
be here. Welcome, everybody. I'm Shira Donath. I'm in Fair Lawn, New Jersey.
And
Regine, do you want to introduce yourself?
sure. I'm Regine Galanti. I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in anxiety and OCD, and I have a private practice in Long Island.
Great. So, I want to start this evening by sharing a Torah thought with all of you. I recently heard an audio clip of Rav Soloveitchik talking about his personal experience when he was learning Torah. And he described this sense of tranquility that he felt when he was learning. He said that sometimes he would fall into these pits of a depressed mood almost. And when he learned Torah, I'll use the English translation because he was speaking in Yiddish. He said, I felt a soothing hand, a motherly hand supporting my head that tells me you are not alone. And he went on to say that when we make Birchos HaTorah in the morning, there are two versions of the bracha that we say. One is Al Divrei Torah, and one is La'asok B'Divrei Torah. And La'asok B'Divrei Torah is the one that's most commonly used. And he asked, why don't we use the words Lilmod Torah? Why is that not part of the bracha? Because what we're doing when we're interfacing with Torah is we're learning it. So why do we not make a bracha on learning Torah? It's not even brought up as an option of the Nusach. And what the Ref said is that Torah is supposed to be something that becomes one's friend, becomes one's companion. We don't have a purely intellectual relationship with Torah. And the Rav describes that learning Torah is about building an emotional union with Torah and with God. It's something that's supposed to instill within us this tranquil experience of connection with God. And if we don't experience that when we're learning Torah and doing mitzvot, then something is off. If it becomes too much about getting caught in the minutia of mitzvot, and we don't have the experience of emotional tranquility, of that fusion with Torah and with God, then we know something is not right. Scrupulosity is an example of when religion and religious practice can become distorted, not only just a little bit focusing on the minutia, but really distorted and disordered. So I'm excited to be speaking here with Dr. Regine Galanti about OCD and specifically scrupulosity and its interface with Taharat HaMishpacha. So, Dr. Galanti, Regine, you want me to call you that? What is OCD? Can you start us off with that?
Sure. I also love that introduction. I think it's a really good frame that to talk about OCD in the context of emotion, because OCD is an emotional disorder, an emotional problem. So it makes sense to view it in that frame. So when I hear OCD, and scrupulosity is actually religious OCD, um, the way I think of it is there are three pieces. There are the obsessions, the compulsions, and the disordered part. Obsessions are thoughts. So when I think of OCD, one of the highlights of the disorder in my practice is the presence of anxiety based on these thoughts. Um, so everyone thinks all day long, but obsessions are intrusive thoughts that get stuck. So if I have a thought that car is red, it's just going to kind of come and go, pass through my brain. Not going to pay much attention to it. If I instead think that red car is coming directly towards me and is going to smash right into me, all of a sudden I'm going to feel really anxious. Whether or not that thought is actually true is almost irrelevant to the fact that me thinking it makes me anxious. So, and that's kind of normal. Everybody has these kind of weird thoughts that come and go sometimes. And most of the time we say, oh, that's weird. Like if you've ever had the thought like, oh, maybe I should cross the street even though a car is coming, or my kid's bus is 5 minutes late. What if, God forbid, something happened to them? That's an intrusive thought. It makes you anxious. What most people without the disorder part do is kind of nothing. You might worry a little bit more for a few minutes, but then you don't do anything. One of my earliest kind of intrusive thought memories is not to walk on a manhole cover, because like I'd always had that thought that like it would collapse under me. And so you just take 2 steps out of the way. It's not a big deal. Except that if I talk to my current kind of self, about that, I would say actually that is kind of a big deal. And it's not so good to avoid, because when you avoid, you actually make the fear worse. And that gets into that second part of OCD, the compulsion part. So when people with OCD have a thought, have an obsession that makes them feel nervous, what they're going to do, or scared or anxious, what they're going to do is they're going to do something. They're going to do a compulsion. And a compulsion is a ritual. It's a thing you do to make the anxiety go away. So you think, oh my gosh, that car is going to hit me, even though it's way too far and it's not something you have to worry about. And you take 7 steps back. Or you think, oh my gosh, maybe I cheated on the test, and you go and confess to your teacher that maybe you cheated on an exam, even though like there's no proof of that, but you kind of have to fix it. So compulsions are things we do to make that anxiety go away. And in theory, that should be kind of a closed loop, because if you have an obsession, which is a thought, and that thought makes you anxious, and then you do something about it and you feel better, then there's nothing to talk about. But the disorder part comes in is basically because the compulsion doesn't work. So it works and it gives you temporary relief in some cases. Sometimes it doesn't give you as much relief as you want. But then a couple minutes later, a couple days later, the obsessions come back in. Like maybe you didn't check well enough. Maybe you should go and just like triple check on that thing. And then you say, okay, well, maybe I did something wrong. And you go and let's say you check the lock to make sure it's locked again. And, you know, and then you sit back down and your anxiety is good until a few minutes later. And what if I unlocked the door when I locked it? And now we're stuck in this loop that you don't know how to get out of, because the way you get out of it is by doing the thing that makes you less anxious, but that thing is not working. So that loop is very important for OCD. And the disorder part is because it really ruins people's lives. When people say OCD as an adjective, there's no bigger pet peeve than I can imagine, like that I have in this world, than people saying like, oh, OCD, it's, you know, I'm OCD, I'm very neat. That's not what it is. It hits a lot of different areas of your life. So that's a long answer to, I guess, a short question that you just had, Shira.
It was very thorough, though, so that was very helpful. So what is scrupulosity? And is that a type of OCD? Is it different? Can you just explain that for us?
Yeah, so scrupulosity is type of OCD. It's actually, technically, the definition of scrupulosity is fearing sin when there is none. So, and I actually think it's a great definition. It's when you're have OCD about religious practice, we call that scrupulosity. So you're going to have thoughts that relate to religion somehow that make you anxious, which, if you're going to go back to Shira, the way you started, that's the opposite of that emotional tranquility idea. It's instead, those thoughts are making you anxious. So then you do something about them, or you think something about them, or you try to make them go away. And by trying to make them go away, you feel better, except again, the system doesn't work. So common religious obsessions are doubts of sin by mistake. Like when I glanced around the room, did I cheat on the test? Or having intrusive, sacrilegious, or blasphemous thoughts or images, like while you're praying, like thinking like, oh, did I pray to my friend who was standing in front of me? Was I davening to that instead of like, were my intentions clear? Doubt that you're not faithful or moral enough. What if I don't believe in God well enough? What if I don't believe in God at all? I think I do, but maybe I don't. Maybe I didn't do that prayer or ritual correctly. Maybe I should redo it, which would be the compulsion. That's the thing I do to make myself feel better. Or fear of being punished by God. So, you know, these are pretty common, I think, in a lot of people, but in OCD, they're more crippling.
So would you say that OCD is more common in religious communities?
So I love that you asked that question, because I think it's a question that people ask me all day long, and it's not. There's research on this, and the research shows that OCD is not more prevalent in religious communities than in non-religious communities. It's 1 to 2% in all communities. What is different in religious communities is that OCD latches onto religious ideas more than it will in others. So instead of just counting or cleaning or checking, it's counting or cleaning or checking related to religion. So like if you're going to think about cleaning for Pesach, that's cleaning, but it's a religious version of cleaning. So now we're going to focus on, I've treated patients who have never have chametz in their house, because if you have chametz in your house, you have to clean it out, and if you have to clean it out, then your house might not be okay for Pesach. So, so they take that religious idea, and the OCD latches onto it, which makes a lot of sense, because OCD, because of the nature of anxiety, latches onto what's important to you, because those are the things that can make you anxious. So if it's really important to you to have faith in a real kind, and that's important to your life, it makes sense that OCD is going to come along and say, hey, I'm going to show up here and I'm going to create doubt. And the way I see OCD is really, it's a doubting disease. So it's going to hit you and say, maybe you don't actually believe that thing that you think you believe. I'm just going to kind of poke holes in it. And then it puts people in a very funny position, because they're like, wait, but I do believe, I do, let me prove it to you. But there's no way to prove, especially when you're talking about religion, it's really hard to prove something that's unprovable. So we know it's not more common in religious communities. We also know that OCD in general is hard. It's not, it takes a lot of people a long time to get to the right diagnosis. So especially in religious areas, it is the kind of thing that sometimes gets accidental reinforcement when you're like, oh, look how well that guy davens. He's been at Shemona Esrei for 6 hours. Like, I hear that and my alarm bells go off. I'm like, 6 hours, that's a very long time for someone who's not really whose job is not to daven all day. So I look for that. And then one other thing I look for is the marital distress, which why I think this is a good opportunity to have this conversation, because often scrupulosity does impact a marriage. So it's getting in the way of a lot of those religious values as well.
So these thoughts that you were describing, of these intrusive thoughts related to religion or related to spirituality, how common are they?
So I think that even from the examples I've given, not to put you on the spot, but the idea of just having noise in our brains and having thoughts that are not necessarily true, they happen to everyone. I'm sure if you thought about it, sure, you could think of times when even in your religious life, you're like, oh, do I not, is that, do I believe what I think I believe? Maybe I did cheat. Maybe I did do this the way I wasn't supposed to, or was supposed to. But that's normal. So it's normal for everyone to have these kind of thoughts from time to time. And most people view them as mental noise.
Okay. So then when do they become problematic?
So I think they become problematic when you take them and you say, oh, this is threatening. This thought is dangerous to me. I cannot have this thought. I need to make it go away. This is second with thoughts, with everything else. If I want to throw out my phone, I can take it and I can throw it in the garbage and I'll never see it again. But if I take a thought and I want to throw it in the garbage, it is the best way to make sure that that thought comes back and it hits me in the head. It will keep reappearing over and over and over and over. So the second you say, I don't want that thought in my life, you're basically giving that thought an open invitation to make you miserable for as long as it can, and it will. So the way we understand scrupulosity is that we misinterpret these common intrusive thoughts in a way that raises doubts religiously. And by raising doubts, then we all of a sudden make these thoughts way more significant than they actually are. So you start with oh, have I committed a sin by mistake? Or do I have sufficient faith in God? Or does God approve of me? Or is God angry with me? Or where am I going to go when I die? Or have I done enough davening and have I done it right? Am I pure enough? Am I too proud? Am I obeying halacha the right way? And all these thoughts have roots in religious doctrine, but they get exaggerated when you're talking about OCD.
So when you take this all and you try to think what it practically looks like, how does this play out for someone? Can you give us a picture of what this really looks like?
So I think you start with that fear of sin or fear of God, which leads to more obsessions. And another facet of OCD that I should mention is there's this intolerance of uncertainty. So you're thinking to yourself, did I daven enough, right? And now you're thinking, oh, well, that I can't handle the fact that I might not have davened enough or with enough kavanah. So that leads to a really high level of anxiety. Like, I need to know. And the best way to know is to just do more of it, right? Like, I should just repeat tefillah then, and then I'll be okay. So you do that compulsion of, let's say, repeating the tefillah or the word, and then you you feel like, okay, now I'm getting to more certainty here, so I'm okay. But the problem is, since you really can never get to certainty, it's this zero sum game, because that just leads to more uncertainty and more intrusions and more obsessions, which then occasionally you do feel better when you get, like, you hit the notes exactly right, but it's a temporary relief that then, like, the next time you dive in, let's say, like, it's just going to all come back. So it's a really crippling disorder.
Right.
So I'm wondering now to, I guess, flip it a little bit. So how have you seen this manifest in the areas of Taharat and HaMishpacha?
Yeah, I've definitely seen this come up for Taharat HaMishpacha. Sometimes women will have intrusive thoughts about becoming nida. So did I become nida? Did I become nida? And sometimes women are told to avoid looking for blood, to avoid becoming nida. So if you don't see staining or you don't see blood, then there's no chance that you could become nida because you're not aware of it. And so sometimes women will then start to have thoughts of, what if I really should have become nida, but I didn't because I didn't look? And then it'll create a lot of anxiety that way. And I find that it manifests a lot when there's an ambiguous part of the halachic piece. So, for example, I think the most common area that so everywhere and get questions about is staining versus flowing. What constitutes a stain? What constitutes a flow? And sometimes a woman may be told that she has to make the ultimate call on that decision if she's become nida, because she's the only one who's in her body and seeing what she's seeing. And so some women may have these repeated intrusive thoughts of, did I make the right decision? So I see that coming up a lot when women ask me questions.
I should mention that I always love talking to Yatzat, or just people who are more the front lines, because when I see OCD, it's either already been diagnosed, or these women have been suffering so long that it's time to seek treatment. But this is much more like, kind of, I guess, in the wild, that you get it way before, let's say, I do. That hearing a situation like that is exactly like, that's an obsession, and it's heartbreaking, because unless you're attuned to it, it sounds like just all women have doubts. Like, what is a flow? What is a stain? Who knows? But when these kind of thoughts just don't go away, and you're trying to create certainty in a situation where they can't have certainty, coupled with people not necessarily knowing that this is OCD and how to treat it, or how to manage it, even worse, because if you knew how to treat it, would be wonderful, but that's not your job. So, so are there
absolutely.
are there any compulsions you've picked up on with women related to Taharat HaMishpacha?
Yeah, I would say that connected to a lot of the doubts that women have about, did I become nida or should I have become nida? There's a lot of checking, constantly checking to see if she's bleeding, constantly asking questions about her status. A woman maybe making a call that she has become nida or that she didn't become nida, and then days afterwards continuing to ask. I've gotten calls from a woman from a few women, I've gotten these types of calls that say, last week I saw some bleeding, and fill in the blank with the details. Do you think I made the right decision? I've been driving myself crazy with it ever since then. So that constantly asking again and again if that was the right call, that I would view as a compulsion. I've also seen it come up with calculating days properly, whether it's calculating the days before doing a hefsek Torah or before going to the mikvah, or in calculating vestot. A lot of women may count over and over again. I've had women who have called me multiple times to recount with them. And knowing what I know now about what to do when this comes up, I know that not counting with them is probably the way to go. But not everyone has that information, and I certainly didn't at the beginning of when I was doing this. Um, Also, doing more bedikot that are necessary. I've had women who have brought me stacks of bedikot, and they said that they knew that probably earlier ones that they did were fine for the hefsek Tahara when you're allowed to do more than one, but they wanted it to be completely clean, as opposed to halachically clean, which just means no red on the bedikot cloth. And so then I remind them that you should not do more bedikot than necessary. That's not a higher level of performing this mitzvah. It's actually a problematic thing. You could actually end up cutting yourself, causing yourself some sort of injury by doing more and more bedikot. And that has happened with women who have called me, that they've done way too many bedikot and like way past the point of necessary, and then ended up injuring themselves, and then ended up seeing more bleeding on the bedikot cloth, which made a much more complicated halachic situation. Calculating the precise number of minutes to be in the bath before going to the mikveh, which is not a mitzvah. Just to clarify, that is not something that I advise women to do. Being very exacting about the length of fingernails to make sure that there's no nail that's visible, which is also not necessary, and many other manifestations of this. So I've seen this come up with women who have called me a lot of different times. And I'm wondering what you would say for how you distinguish between normative religious practice and OCD.
So I was going to say it can be tricky. I think it's not tricky when you know what to look for. I think it can be tricky when you're first looking at this, but to say it can be tricky actually is false. I think we just need to educate people to know what to look for, because often scrupulous obsessions and compulsions have a basis in conventional religious practices. So initially you see it and you're like, wow, you're really being so careful about this specific mitzvah. But then when you get down to it, you recognize like this is not normally what we see. So the first thing kind of takeaway that I want people to take is that often OCD gets accidental support from other people viewing it as just overzealous religious observance. But it's not across the board. Typically, it's like in very specific facets of behavior. So let's say someone is compulsive about Taharat and HaMishpacha. It's not that they're compulsive about like other mitzvot also. It just tends to come up in these very specific ways where all of a sudden a woman will like be ignoring her family, let's say, for the week before she has to go to the mikvah because she needs to, one, make sure everything stays clean. So if she makes dinner, then, something might get on her hands, so it's not worth it. So, it's actually doing her family and herself a disservice. And then kind of her life has to revolve around it. That's not religion, I would argue, the way we practice it. So it's typically excessive, and it's typically rigid, and it's typically super specific. So it often also gets in the way of broader religious principles. So you can view scrupulosity as a barrier to the spiritual connection to God. It's in the service to God, but the distress caused from OCD makes people ritualize in the service of OCD rather than the service to God. And often, or not often, it's sometimes even in violation of the halacha. So I like to think of it like that. So the example that you gave with doing bedikot to the point of like hurting yourself is not exactly in violation, but often with, let's say, repeating brachot. I'll get that a lot, like patients who will just repeat and they know they're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to move on, but their OCD needs them to get it right, and it doesn't matter what the actual halacha is in terms of that. So sometimes I'll see that, or people doing things on Shabbat, let's say, that they're not allowed to do because they need to get ready for the mikvah. Now all of a sudden you're stuck in this kind of catch-22 where your OCD wants one thing and religion wants another thing, and you can't distinguish between the two. And I like to think generally also that healthy religious practice is normally associated with positive emotions. Normally, we're looking for a connection to God in a positive way. But religious compulsions and OCD are normally associated with fear and anxiety. I can't get this wrong. So instead of that moderate, flexible beliefs, like I think you gave the example of like one of the problems for obsessions in Taharat HaMishpacha is the ambiguity that actually is present in halacha. That ambiguity is there, so you can be flexible. But for women with OCD and men as well, but not normally in the area of Taharat HaMishpacha, the flexibility is a barrier. It's no, you have to tell me, and even if it's stricter, and even if it means that it's actually going to get in the way of, let's say, my ability to have a child, because I have to be so careful about my checks that even though the person I'm asking is saying, I am okay, I am not okay, because my anxiety is so high that if I were to go to the mikveh this night, it would make me too anxious. That's not enough. I'll wait another month. Hopefully it'll work out next month. So scrupulosity is really more about avoiding guilt and severe punishment and avoiding the anxiety. So I look for distress specifically, and I look for functionality. So most people who engage in healthy religious devotion are basically also inoculated against scrupulosity by their faith, by their belief in God. Versus when you have OCD, it's really like God is really punishing. Like your view of God is normally really like, I picture it more like the Greek gods, like ready to throw lightning bolts at you, versus someone flexible who's like, or a flexible situation where you're allowed to make mistakes and be forgiven for them.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. It's helpful to just frame this all within the context of Taharat HaMishpacha, which we're talking about, and just to understand the ins and outs and the behind the scenes, what's going on for someone. Do you have any practical advice for people who are recognizing scrupulous behavior, either in themselves or in others?
So I have a lot of advice. I can probably talk about this for 3 days. One thing I would definitely focus on is I didn't mention the way we really treat OCD, the way I treat OCD, and the effective treatments that we know for OCD is a therapy called exposure and response prevention, or exposure therapy. So basically it involves cutting out the avoidance that of anxiety that an individual with OCD is trying to do. So instead of being anxious and therefore doing things to make you feel less anxious, the goal is to help people recognize that anxiety is an emotion, and emotions will fade with time if you do nothing about them. So instead of doing all these things to make yourself feel better, you should, and I'm saying this knowing that it's a process and knowing that I work with people for not just a minute, so I can say this, but just keep that in mind. It's not as easy as it sounds. You should face the fear and cut out the compulsions that you're doing instead. So what that means is typically it means accepting the anxiety and doing something initially that feels like it's impossible because you're feeling so anxious that you kind of even can't bear it, but then seeing what happens after. So let's say not doing those extra bidikot and going to the mikveh anyway, feeling like you're completely impure, but trusting that you're not. But that trust is a logical process, and the feeling like you're impure is an emotional one. So they kind of don't work on the same level. And often what I see is when people are not trained to recognize OCD or treat OCD, what they'll do is they'll try to talk to their friends or family members like it's a logical problem. Like, don't you see? This makes no sense. And that doesn't work. I can talk about logic till I'm blue in the face, but when you're dealing with an emotional problem, it doesn't work. I like to think of it almost like when I'm angry about something, And I know I make no sense because I recognize somewhere around the line that I stopped like being logical, but I can't stop myself from feeling angry yet. But even though like I made the mistake, it's not the Verizon's guy's fault, it's my fault. But like I can't undo that, so now I'm yelling and like it has nothing to do with him, but I can't stop myself. So anxiety works the same way. Other therapists will talk about like it's like arguing with someone who's drunk. Like it doesn't matter how much logical sense you make. Emotionally, it's just like it's just not going to work out. So you have to stop that approach. And the approach we take instead is help them face their fear and don't contribute to what they're doing to get out of their fear. So that was, again, my long kind of way around to talk about the important part for people suffering is to, if you have someone in your life that you're saying, okay, that sounds a lot like OCD now that you mention it, the goal is if they ask a question 6 times and you're used to answering it 6 times and sitting down with them and explaining and explaining and explaining, that's not helpful for them. It might be helpful for them right now, but you're actually doing them a disservice in the long term. That's a word we call accommodation. So accommodation are the things that we do in the service of OCD that we wouldn't do for other people. So, you know, if you know that a specific friend when they call need you to answer right away, and if you don't answer right away, they're going to think you hate them. So you're very, very careful about that. Versus anyone else, you kind of might let go to voicemail and then call back later. Once I know that someone has OCD, I'm going to be very mindful of not answering the first time instead and building towards that. I'm actually curious on that one. I have a lot more to say on treatment, but Shira, I'm wondering how Yoetzet's advice in Taharat HaMishpacha might fit in with this idea of accommodation or non-accommodation.
Yeah, it comes up actually all the time. I've had women who have come to me with the same question over and over and over again, not in new scenarios, just for the same scenario, repeat asking, because they couldn't sit with the answer, and they kept having those thoughts that caused them to keep coming back to ask the same question. And so I've had to just cut off the questions, put a stop to it, and say, I've already answered you. You have my answer, and that's it. We're not going to address this anymore. And I sometimes worry that the caller may think that I'm being mean or I'm being rude, which at face value, if you don't understand the mechanics behind the repeat asking and what accommodation is, then it could seem like I'm being rude or I'm being mean, but it's actually in the caller's best interest. And so that definitely comes up a lot with all the examples I gave of, you know, telling them that they shouldn't bring me this type of color of badika anymore because it's not a question. Telling them, you know, that this has been addressed, that we're not going to answer that question. And the example that you gave also of needing an answer to come right away, that they can't wait for an answer. I've had situations in which women have called me and told me that it's an emergency. And so I've, you know, promptly returned their call to find out that it was actually something that we had discussed before that was very not time sensitive. And so then I learned from that. She hadn't told me that she had OCD, but I learned from there that this is the type of presentation that she was coming with, and that in order to put a stop to it, in order to stop accommodating that behavior of needing an answer right away and not being able to sit with that ambiguity or not having an answer, I started delaying the time that I would call her back or that I would respond to text messages. And either it worked or she started going to a different Yoetzet who didn't do that. But that is definitely a way that I apply these principles of not accommodating someone's OCD when I'm interfacing with women. I'll also put a plug that if you do have OCD, if you are diagnosed with OCD, then being upfront about that with whoever you're calling, whether it's your Yoetzet, whether it's your rabbi, whether it's your doctor, anyone, being upfront about that can be really, really helpful and really useful. It helps informs the decisions not only of how we'll answer your questions just interpersonally, like we were just describing a second ago, but sometimes the halachic answer will change based on that information, and sometimes in really profound ways. And so being upfront about that information is really helpful for the person that you're asking the question of. So just a little plug for being upfront with people about that.
And I'll also make a plug that the best way to help someone, if you're recognizing scrupulosity or OCD, is to help them get therapy. Like exposure and response prevention works for people with OCD, but only if you get it, and not enough people get to the right treatment. And it is a specialized treatment, but it works. It's hard work, but it really takes people from being able to like suffer through their lives to really live their lives to their fullest. And I see a lot of kids and teens, and parents will always ask me like, oh, like they'll come in and I'll diagnose OCD, and they'll be like, oh, but is this going to affect, their future, their marriage, their children? And I'm like, no, because you got to the right place. We're going to be fine. We're going to teach you coping strategies. You're going to learn to face your fear, and you're going to be okay. But if you didn't, then that's where the problems kind of come in. That our treatments for OCD are actually very effective if you get good treatment, but you need to get good treatment. And I know we got a good question, so I know this one's more for Shira, but are there halachic leniencies that one can rely on to not be as anxious about chatzitzot?
That's a great question. I find that chatzitzot in general can provoke a lot of anxiety for people. And so halachically, it does kind of depend on which chatzitza you're talking about. And so I can't answer in such detail without knowing specifically what the considerations are. But in general, what I teach, especially to kalas when I'm teaching them before they get married, to brides, I say that the goal is to make sure you're clean. So if you take a thorough shower and you know that you're clean, then you're good. And sometimes I've heard that it's been helpful for some people to institute cutoff times for preparation. Like you cannot spend more than an hour preparing for mikvah, or you cannot spend more than X amount of minutes in the bath. And I'm hesitant to give that to a broad audience because I don't know who will take that and then time the minutes that they're preparing, which is also not helpful. But if it does become something that is really taxing, you can definitely ask a question. You can reach out to your yoetzet and talk about how to make it less anxiety provoking for you. There's also a very beautiful source in the Ramban when he describes the process of going to the mikveh. He says that after going to the mikveh, you should feel comfortable with what you did. You should not think about, could I have done this differently? Should I have done something else? Was I really clean enough? Maybe I had a chatzitza on me, because he understood that it's possible for those types of intrusive thoughts to come into your mind. And he says very strongly, once you did it, you're done. You don't think about it again. You leave the mikveh. If you've put in the effort that you need to put in, then that's what's asked of you. And then you fulfilled the mitzvah. And obviously for someone who is struggling with OCD, it can be very difficult to put those thoughts aside and move on and be okay. But there is halachic background and halachic basis for not giving in to those thoughts and going over and over again the preparations that you've done, because it's actually preferable for you to feel confident and comfortable and be okay with what you've done in terms of preparing for the mikvah.
And I would kind of just shift that towards, with OCD, I'm always mindful of words like feel comfortable, don't feel comfortable. Well, we don't go back. We only go forward. So if you feel anxious about it, that's okay, because anxiety is actually an adaptive thing that keeps us alive, right? We don't get hit by cars because we look both ways before we cross the street. Why do we do that? Because we're anxious, and that's good. So like anxiety is this emotion that really keeps us alive, but is malfunctioning in people with OCD. It's not working. You can't trust your feelings because your feelings are telling you, check again. So whenever you feel wrong, doesn't mean you actually are wrong. It means that you feel wrong. So not trusting that, but listening to someone who's going to say, okay, you put in your due diligence, now move on. Doing that is actually exposure. It's actually like you're facing the fear that I did something wrong, but you're trusting the right sources to do what's right and changing kind of behaviorally. I'm a behavior therapist, so it shows up a lot. I like to think about like, what does my behavior need to look like in order to for me to look like I want to look, rather than how am I supposed to feel, how I want to feel, which is an unachievable goal, because I can kind of be stuck in prep forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and never feel good. And right, this gets back to this being a normative experience. I know so many women who have had the experience of like, I'm just going to fix this one thing and then I messed it up. Like I messed up my nail and now I made it worse and I should have stopped when I had the chance and now I'm stuck in that loop. Like it's normal. But at some point, someone without OCD will just say, okay, I'm good. Versus someone with OCD will, be bleeding and raw and there's no way to fix that.
Right. And unfortunately, that has come up for me. And it's a really painful and really unfortunate situation when that is the case. I also want to let the audience know that if you haven't submitted a question and you want to, you definitely can submit questions and we'll be on the lookout for them.
Yeah. I'll also mention, based on what you were just saying, Shira, this idea that like, I do think that even in my work, it's a partnership between, I often talk to, Yotzat or rabbis about individual cases. OCD is not a one-size-fits-all all disorder at all. So knowing one person with OCD, one person with OCD. So I often work with just whoever needs to be worked with in terms of like setting up what the halachic kind of decisions for this person needs to be. I'll kind of go through my ideal prep list with whoever I'm supposed to go through it with and say, okay, is this okay? Like, is this allowed? Because this is what I want to do. I want to help them face their fear, but I also want to make sure that they're not doing anything wrong from your eyes, but we also have to kind of have a united front because I'm not the halachic authority for this person, nor do I want to be. But so what can we do to kind of make this happen? And sometimes I often love you prep for an hour, because with OCD, they want to prep perfectly, but then you're stuck prepping only for an hour. So you have to kind of prioritize, and it puts them in a really tricky position to actually get anything done. But I would never say that blanketly, because then you have people without OCD who are like, wait, I could just do this, no problem. Like, no, because you're not going to do it the same way as the patient who's already scrupulous about this. They're going to do it extra. So for them, it's a punishment. For you, it's a benefit. It's not the same. You're coming from very different places.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone is unique, and we treat each person as an individual. And that partnership that you're describing is so important between the yotzet, the therapist, and any of the people who can be working together to help the person who is struggling. Regine, there is a question that I think came in for you, so I'll present it to you if that's okay. In non-scrupulosity OCD, people learn to handle non-accommodation and nothing bad happens, so they become less anxious in future situations. However, in scrupulosity, the worry isn't that something bad will happen right away, but that something will be wrong spiritually. How does non-accommodation help?
So again, I would disagree with the premise. I think that might be true of some people, not everyone, because with OCD, it's very important to individualize treatment. I don't know what someone is anxious about until I treat that individual. And I talk a lot about something called like a core fear, like what's behind your fear. Not in a kind of what happened to you when you were 3 kind of sense, because that's not the kind of psychologist I am. It's much more like what will happen if this bad thing happens to you. If you don't prep 100%, what will happen? And it might be like, okay, so I wrong God and God will hate me forever. So if that's the case, how can I live with that? And the core fear is God will hate me forever. And what are the implications of that on my life? And how do I face that? So obviously, I'm not going to make them, I don't know, face hating God. I guess kind of I would. That one's a little bit abstract, but I would never make anyone do something that's against halacha or that is not in tune with their values. But often, because OCD is a disorder that involves a lot of doubt, it's more exposure to doubt that we never know. I don't know if God loves me right now. I hope that God loves me right now, but I do not know that. And if I if I put all my eggs in that basket, I'm just going to fail. So it's okay. It's probably true that God loves me, but it also could be true that I did something that was so terrible that I don't know about today that made God hate me, and I'm going to be punished for it. And I need to live with that doubt. But also, that's probably not true. But how do I live with that? I face it, because if I get used to facing that, we call that like almost imaginary scenario, almost like we do creative writing assignments where we write out these really scary things and then we read them over and over. You get used to it. My big exposure example is if I locked you in a room with a dog and you were afraid of dogs, you would hate me and you shouldn't come back to me because therapy is all about consent. But you would get used to the dogs. It might take like 6 hours. It might take 8. It probably won't. It'll probably take a lot less than that. And then you tell me like, okay, dogs are bad, but that dog's fine. That dog's an exception. Like, if you face things that you're afraid of, you get used to it because our brains just can't handle it. So it's about staying on that level of fear. So even when there's nothing concrete to kind of like face, what we do is we face the scary things that are at the end of the fear, which I know is a little vague, but it can be scary for people, but you do adjust to it. Even if it's kind of philosophical. We do this all the time, like almost, I'm going to use a terrible example. People might not like this, but like we fear bad things happening to our kids all the time. I think that's a very normal thing. Most people, though, don't live in that space 24/7 because if you did, there's so much that can happen to your kids at any moment in the house and outside of the house. OCD is about that fear being your whole life. So then we need to kind of go for it in a way that would be uncomfortable for anyone. So these thoughts, they would be uncomfortable for anyone if someone's really afraid of being punished by God. But honestly, then I talk a lot about like what we value. Like, is that the God you believe in? And I'll say kind of tongue in cheek, but actually, I'm like, if that was the God I believed in, that's a terrible way to live. Like, again, we're back to almost like Greek mythology. I'm getting punished for things that I don't even know. Like, I'm living a pretty good life. So helping people with OCD see that. Well, we just got a lot of questions.
And I'm trying to read through them very quickly. One just came in that asked me to share an example of a case in which the answer to a halachic question is different for a person struggling with OCD or scrupulosity. Or are there any sources that directly address different answers for those with scrupulosity? So for this question, I'll actually give an example of a case I had in which a woman who asked me questions would sometimes bring stacks of veggie and say, I know they're all red, I know they're bad, but like you told me when you were teaching me Kala classes that I should just always ask, every time I think it might be bad, I should ask you anyways. And so, which is not exactly what I say in Kala classes, but that was the message that she heard. And so when I looked through these veggie, almost always they were totally fine colors, like not remotely close to red. It would be sometimes clear, sometimes yellow, sometimes tan, which are totally fine halachically to see in a veggie cloth. And this would happen month after month after month, that she would show me colors that she said in her mind were 100% problematic. There was no doubt in her mind that they were red, but she was showing them to me anyways. And this same woman then called me a couple months later and said that she was sure that she saw a red stain on the inside of her thigh, and it was bigger than a penny. But she wiped it away and threw the toilet paper in the toilet, and so she no longer had the color to show me. And she wanted to know if she was Nita. So if someone calls me and they say that they saw a red stain on the inside of their thigh that was bigger than a penny, classically, that would be something that would make a woman nida. For this woman, she had come to me so many times previously and said that she was sure the color was red when it was absolutely not even close to red, that I didn't know if I could trust her her description of the color. And so I called a posek and discussed it with him at length. And he actually said in this situation that she had almost given up her ability to like, in halachic terminology, it's like to testify what the color is, but she had given up her ability to describe colors accurately. She had forfeited it, not given it up. That's a little bit different in terms of meaning. But I couldn't rely on her accounting of what she saw, and so he actually said that we could be mekel and not consider her mitzvah. And so that was a case in which it was mekel for her, considering the circumstances. But I've also had a number of other times in which we had to be more machmir. And so each case has to be addressed very individually and with consultation with poskim and understanding really what's going on for this individual person. But it definitely is something that can impact halachically.
I love that example too, because there's this idea that we have in OCD, we call it the gun test. It's like if I held a gun to your head and I asked you that question, what would your answer be? Or like in Scrupulosity, it's sometimes called the McDonald's cheeseburger test. It's like, is this equivalent to eating a cheeseburger at McDonald's? And asking that question sometimes, probably not in the case that you described, helps people distinguish between their emotional response to something and their logical response. Like the fact that this woman is asking these questions tells you something, because honestly, if a woman without OCD asks that question, you're like, why are you asking? You clearly know the halacha. Like, sorry, you're in nida. There's not a question. But she's asking because somewhere she knows emotionally that it doesn't fit with what she's actually seeing. So she's asking because she probably knows it's okay. Even though she kind of wants you to tell you that it's not okay because it's not okay. Like, so it's a tricky situation, but I like that way of distinguishing between emotion and logic.
Mm-hmm.
I got another question that I think is probably for both of us, or I think we could both have something to say. What suggestions do you have for mitzvah attendants who may encounter people with OCD and potentially trigger them with questions about how much they've prepared, how deep their dunks are, et cetera, et cetera? How should a person with OCD communicate that the mitzvah attendant without being needlessly vulnerable? So I love this question because I actually think it's a broader question. I think that there's a lot of situations where mikveh attendance can accidentally be triggering. And I honestly think that part of the answer is with women being more assertive about like, this is what I do, and like accepting, again, this is the exposure therapist in me, accepting that the mikveh lady might or might not judge you for that, and that's okay because you need to do what's right for you no matter what. So I'm Sephardi, so often I have this. I'm like, sorry, this is what I do. And they look at me like, what? That's what you do? Yep, that's what I do. Just because you have OCD and you're kind of going in knowing that like this is a big weight on your shoulder doesn't mean that they have a right to that information. So you going in and saying like, nope, I did what I needed to do. And please don't ask me any questions. That's okay, even if you're a little standoffish. Shira, I'm wondering if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah. For mikveh attendants, if you see a woman who is not coming out of the preparation room because she's not okay with the amount of preparation that she's done, whether she's repeating it or doing it for way too long, or if you have a woman who will repeat dunks over and over again, even though you said kosher, that can be an indication to you that a woman has OCD. And I would say that try to be on the lookout for it, because somebody with OCD likely won't come into the mikveh and say, I have OCD, so like know how to deal with me. Usually they don't say that, just like most women coming into the mikveh don't usually announce very personal things about themselves or identify themselves in a way that the mikveh lady doesn't already know them. So I would say try to be on the lookout for it. And if you see someone who is displaying these types of behaviors, try to utilize the advice that Regine has shared of not accommodating. So if a woman continues to dunk after you've said kosher and and she keeps doing it, and it's not from a minhag that she has, it's just because she wasn't okay with it, you can cut it off. You can say, okay, you've finished your number of dunks. Now I'm moving on to the next person, or the mikvah's closing for tonight, or whatever you have to do to kind of wrap it up and guide her out of there. And the same with preparations. If she is taking way too long on preparations because she's having that compulsion, then you can tell her, like, time's up. We got to go. Like, it's your turn. So that way it cuts it off. But again, trying to be on the lookout. Okay, there's another question that came in. Regine, were there any questions that you specifically wanted to answer?
Well, I noticed there was a couple questions about kala classes and making sure women don't develop compulsions. And when I get questions like that, I'm like, let me go back to the way I explained OCD. You don't necessarily have to worry about a kala developing OCD if a kala did not have an anxiety disorder before. If she only develops OCD in the area of Taharat HaMishpacha, she probably had it in some undiagnosed area beforehand. It normally comes out in people's teens. So, like, chances are it's not only coming out there. That being said, I'm sure there are things that Yoatzot or like Yoatzot can do in kala classes to make women more aware that this is not the way they're supposed to be treating the halacha, and like being mindful of the, like, knowing the individual woman that you're talking to and saying, okay, this is not someone that it will be helpful for to harp on specific details with, because they will take that and they will think that that is what I need to do. But I don't think you have to worry about bringing out OCD in someone in this area, because OCD is a disorder. That's an anxiety, like, it's an anxiety disorder, and it latches on to religious area. That is just another sign that this person should seek treatment.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes people ask if there are people who specialize in OCD or anxiety when they're teaching. Somebody actually asked a question similar to this. So there are yoatzot who are more knowledgeable in OCD or anxiety. And there also are other trained Kala teachers. Nishmat has trained Kala teachers other than yoatzot who also have backgrounds in psychology and other fields that in which they can be really knowledgeable about how to teach someone with anxiety or OCD. And so you can definitely reach out to any of the Yoatzot or to Nishmat on the website and ask if they can refer you to someone who can specialize in treating, in teaching someone with OCD or anxiety. Finding someone who is a good fit for you, no matter what your background is and no matter what it is that you specifically want a match for, is really important.
Oh, I'm very glad we got to have this conversation, and
Yeah.
I hope that you all learned something that you didn't know before. And yeah.
Regine, this was so nice. Thank you for joining me for this conversation.
My pleasure.